There are people who can walk into a room and suddenly your body is no longer fully yours. Maybe it's a family member, maybe it's an old colleague, maybe it's someone you used to trust, or maybe it's someone you love. And even if you've done therapy, even if you've grown, you understand what happened, your nervous system still reacts. Your chest tightens, your thoughts speed up. You might scan the room. You might find yourself bracing. And the question becomes, how do I stay myself in spaces where I don't feel fully safe or fully settled or fully resolved? In today's episode, we're talking about building bandwidth, not endurance and not avoidance, but bandwidth. I'm your host, Jackie Pack, and I'm glad to have you here with me today. Bandwidth is not pretending something doesn't affect you. It's not forcing yourself to be okay when internally your nervous system clearly is not okay. And it's not shutting down so completely that nothing appears to bother you. Bandwidth is something much more honest than that. Bandwidth is your nervous system's growing capacity to stay present inside discomfort without immediately losing access to yourself. It is the ability to feel activated and still retain autonomy and have some choice. To notice your chest tighten, your thoughts speed up, or your urge to either shut down or overmanage. And instead of being completely overtaken by that reaction, to remain connected enough to yourself that you can respond with intention. Bandwidth means that discomfort is present, but it's not fully in charge. It means you can stay connected to your thoughts, your values, your boundaries, and your preferences, even when something relationally feels hard. And that takes time to develop because so many of us learned survival strategies instead of regulation strategies. We learned how to endure. We learned how to avoid. We learned how to dissociate or how to people please and how to emotionally shut down. Healing asks whether we can build enough internal capacity to stay connected to ourselves when the relationships around us or a relationship within us feels unresolved. When the conversation is unfinished or when the tension is still there. When someone hasn't changed and when clarity hasn't fully come. Can we remain grounded in who we are, even when the external situation still feels messy? In today's episode, we're going to talk about the differences between enduring and regulating, avoidance and choice, boundaries and emotional shutdown, tolerance and genuine bandwidth, and protecting yourself versus abandoning yourself. And I will connect this conversation to attachment, differentiation, to trauma histories, emotional regulation, and the unresolved relational narratives that so often shape how we move through difficult relationships. Let's start off talking about enduring versus regulating. A lot of people think they're doing well because they can tolerate being around difficult people. They might say, I handled it, or I got through it, or it wasn't that bad. But when we look a little bit deeper, what they're often describing isn't regulation, it's endurance. Endurance is holding yourself together just enough to make it through. It's the version of yourself that tightens up, braces internally, and is just waiting for it to be over. You might look calm on the outside, but inside you're counting the minutes, rehearsing what you'll say next, feeling the tension in your body and trying not to react. Endurance says, just get through this. And for many of us, endurance was a necessary survival skill. It helped us navigate our families of origin or other relationships and environments where we didn't have the power to change what was happening. So there's no judgment in that skill of enduring. But regulation is something different. Regulation doesn't mean you stay perfectly calm. It means you can feel activated and still stay connected to yourself. You notice your body tightening, or your thoughts speeding up, or your emotions rising. And instead of being completely overtaken by that experience, you actually support yourself through it. You take deep breaths. You ground yourself, bringing yourself to the present. Remind yourself where you are. You remind yourself where you are. And you can make a choice about how you want to respond. Regulation says, I'm here, I'm aware, and I still have some agency and autonomy. And this is the place where we can start to grow, where we can start to grow and expand bandwidth. Because the goal isn't to eliminate discomfort. The goal is to build enough internal capacity that discomfort no longer fully dictates your behavior. You're not just enduring and getting through the moment anymore. You're actually in it, aware of it, while still being with yourself. So why do certain people impact us? Difficult people aren't always difficult only because of the past. Sometimes that's true. And sometimes they're difficult because of what they're doing right now. I think that can be an important distinction. Sometimes it's about the relationship we have with them in the past, but sometimes it's more present. In therapeutic language, we often talk about triggers as if everything is coming from an old wound. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes a person activates past rejection, old shame, or earlier experiences of not feeling safe. But sometimes the situation is more complex. Sometimes the person in front used to be unsafe and still is. Maybe you used to think the person was safe, and then you learned they weren't. Or they used to behave in harmful ways, and you're noticing that they're repeating those patterns. Maybe that person is just currently dysregulated, defensive, or dismissive, but you also have a history with them being safe. Or maybe the person is interacting in ways that don't feel emotionally safe for whatever reason. Your nervous system is doing two things at once. It may be recognizing something familiar from your past, and it may be accurately reading what is happening in the present. And that's why the goal or the work isn't about dismissing your reactions. It's about increasing your ability to discern, to ask, is this activation coming from an old storyline? Or is there something happening right now that doesn't feel safe or aligned? And often the answer is both. So we have to be able to discern, is my reaction fitting what's happening? Or does it feel bigger than the situation? Someone can tap into an old wound and also behave in ways that reinforce it in the present. Or sometimes this person is part of our old wound. They helped create that old wound. And we've never resolved it. And they still feel unsafe today. Which is why bandwidth is not about convincing yourself that everything is fine. Or you shouldn't feel activation. It's about staying connected enough to yourself that you can respond wisely to both your history and your current reality. When activated, we move into fight, which is defensiveness, anger, or flight, avoidance, even if that's dissociating and leaving the present moment. Sometimes we actually are trying to avoid running into this person. Or we run into them and we're looking for any way to escape. It might go into a freeze response where we completely shut down and we feel numbness. We feel nothing really. Or we move into a fawning response and we become over-accommodating or people-pleasing. Bandwidth means noticing these responses in ourselves and being able to recover faster. Bandwidth is also deeply tied to differentiation. So the more you're practicing differentiation, that ability to stay connected to yourself while in connection with others, your bandwidth will expand. Differentiation in these situations would be demonstrating the ability to keep your thoughts, keep your preferences, and not just collapse into old roles. Because difficult relationships can often pull us back into roles like the peacekeeper, the caretaker, the achiever, or the invisible one. Let me give a real example. I have a former colleague that I still see at certain professional conferences. There's 1,000 people, maybe more. I don't know. I've never been very good at estimating how many numbers of people are at one place. But that former colleague is often there, and they are not somebody that I can trust anymore. I would say this person was somebody I did trust and saw as being a safe person until I realized they weren't a safe person and maybe were never a safe person. Now, I have done my work on this. I'm not planning to ever repair the relationship. And I feel like I have as much closure as I myself can give myself. And I feel like I have enough closure, but I still don't feel safe around them. I'm not going to engage them at a conference. I don't want to have a one-on-one conversation or even a small group conversation that I'm a part of. So what would bandwidth here look like? I think it's not pretending that you feel neutral. I don't feel neutral about this person. It's saying I can be aware of where they are without letting them take up my entire experience. I don't hide at the conference. I don't try to stay out of sight. Bandwidth for me in this setting becomes intentional awareness instead of constant vigilance. It's anchoring to purpose and choosing where my attention goes. I think it's also recognizing that no amount of healing is going to eliminate this need I have for awareness. Yes, healing can reduce how much space that awareness takes and whether or not I can actually be present when I'm at the conference or present with other people that I engage with. Often before going to that professional conference, I have to anchor myself. I have to do some prep work. knowing that I will see this person at the conference. I anchor myself in my own story. Who am I? What do I know about myself? What have I learned? I can acknowledge grief around that relationship without collapsing into self-doubt. And I also decide this conference belongs to me too. I don't expect for them not to be there, but I also get to be there, and I get to take up the space I want to take up. I was talking with a person. We're in, I would say, tangential areas of doing this work. And we've opened a conversation talking about potential collaboration. We've had multiple conversations throughout this year on Zoom or in text messages. One of the last Zoom calls that I had towards the end, we usually talk for an hour and a half. And towards the end, he said to me, okay, Jackie, one thing you have to know before agreeing to collaborate with me is that I have critics. And if you collaborate with me, you'll probably hear from them. He said, some of them, I know why they're critical of me. Others, I've never even talked to. I don't even know them. I've just heard what they've said about me. And I don't know why they're critics of me. And I responded and said, I have critics too. And then I told him, I said, one of the things I've heard Dr. Patrick Carnes say many times, probably 5 to 7 times, I've heard him say this. And Dr. Carnes comes by this honestly. He's had this experience. This is not something he's just offering advice on that he hasn't had to learn personally. And I told this person this, and I said, what he has said is, when you're doing the work that you're called to do, you're going to have critics. You can either spend your time answering your critics, or you can spend your time doing the work that you were called to do. But you can't do both. And I said, I'm sure if you have critics, yeah, I might hear from them. And I'll come and have a conversation with you. And you need to be aware I have critics too. If you hear from them, please approach me. Let's have a conversation about it. Because I do think the question becomes how much time and space we give to our critics. And how much does that take away from what we're called to do? Bandwidth here is about staying teachable without becoming collapsible. Now let's shift, and I'll give an example in a family setting. What about in situations where there's someone you love, but there's tension? This example and this version carries a very different emotional texture because now the goal usually isn't just managing someone you distrust. There might be distrust there based on the present or based on the past. The goal is to hold space for someone you love while also caring for the tension between you. And that can actually be harder in some ways because love keeps the attachment bond active. There's grief, there's hope, there's concern, maybe protectiveness and disappointment, maybe worry about saying the wrong thing, or fear that one awkward interaction could widen the distance. When the timing doesn't feel right to address the tension yet, whether that's because emotions are high, or because the setting isn't private, or maybe because a holiday table is not the place for repair. Instead, you've got to prepare for something different. So how do we stay connected without forcing resolution? Preparing beforehand might look like clarifying the goal of the gathering. Before going, asking yourself, In this moment, is the goal to celebrate a holiday, maintain connection, reduce awkwardness, communicate care, and maybe simply coexist peacefully? When we go unconsciously hoping maybe we'll finally resolve everything today, we can place too much pressure on ordinary family moments. So we have to accept what is not for this day. And this can be grounding. You might gently tell yourself, today is not for the repair conversation. Today is not the day to process everything. Today is about staying warm enough for what connection there can be. And acceptance reduces that internal tug of war. Preparing ahead of time also involves deciding what kind of presence feels authentic to you. Not performative warmth and not fake closeness. But at getting yourself to a place where you can be kind, you can feel steady, open, respectful, and lightly engaged. Enough to honor the love that you hold while also honoring yourself. I would say another step in preparing to attend is to prepare for your own emotions. Seeing someone you love when there's tension often brings sadness, maybe even grief for how easy the relationship usually feels when things are okay. Letting yourself acknowledge that beforehand can soften reactivity. And then the fifth step would be focusing on small bids for connection. I'm borrowing from the Gottman's language here, where they talk about repair in strained relationships often begins with very small moments. Genuinely asking about their day, or sharing a laugh, offering help in the kitchen, or being able to sit nearby, or sitting nearby and being emotionally available. Not as a strategy, but just as gentle reminders that the relationship still matters. During the gathering, just letting whatever connection can happen be enough. Sometimes when tension exists, people can fall into a role of over-monitoring or even one of parentification. Watching for, are they okay? Did I say something wrong? Did they still seem upset? And while that's understandable, that anxiety can pull us out of the moment. Instead, asking yourself what feels genuine to offer right now, or what are they offering that feels genuine right now? Resisting the urgency to try to bring peace. When we're around relationships where we have attachment, discomfort can often create a sense of urgency. We need to fix this, and we need to fix it quickly. But relational wisdom sometimes says, not here, not now, maybe later with care. And if distance shows up, can you stay regulated? If they seem quieter or less engaged than usual, try not to immediately chase reassurance. Give room and let the relationship breathe. Afterward, when you're back in your own space, you can reflect gently on, did I stay aligned with myself? Did I communicate in ways that felt honest? What emotions came up for me? And what conversation still needs to happen when the time is right? Sometimes love looks like staying connected while giving hard conversations the timing they deserve. Not every moment of tension needs immediate resolution. Some relationships start their healing through steadiness first. When the person is loved, bandwidth often means tolerating the discomfort of an incomplete connection without panicking that the attachment is gone. Because temporary tension in meaningful relationships can feel so threatening, precisely because the bond matters so much. Now let's talk to a different dynamic, and that's couples work, where there's relationship change happening. That dynamic also requires expanding personal bandwidth, because staying in a relationship while it is changing feels destabilizing for both partners. And this is where bandwidth has to become relational, not just individual. Because now the question is, can each partner tolerate the discomfort of change without forcing resolution too quickly? And I would refer here to my episode on uneven healing. I often see with the couples that I work with, there's uneven healing. Sometimes I talk about this in the episode, so go back to that episode. I can put a link to it in the show notes. But sometimes it seems like walking on parallel tracks, and then one person veers off course because they had something, a side issue that came up that has to also be addressed. So for the partner who's doing more growth work at that time, bandwidth often looks like tolerating guilt without abandoning their boundary. So let me talk about a couple of dynamics that is not uncommon for me to encounter when I'm working with couples. Sometimes growth work requires one person to set a boundary in order to clarify some things for themselves. Bandwidth will often look like tolerating guilt without abandoning their boundary. When someone has been a lifelong people pleaser, saying no can feel like I'm hurting my partner, or I'm being selfish, or my boundary is ruining the relationship. They feel internal pressure to soften the boundary or walk it back, to over-explain it or accommodate. Bandwidth here is I can feel the guilt and still stay aligned with what I need or with what is true for me. Accepting that clarity takes time. If they've never had access to their preferences, then I don't know yet is actually an honest answer. But that ambiguity can be hard for both partners. Bandwidth is allowing space for exploration, for uncertainty, and evolving boundaries. They have to let their partner have feelings, because for the partner, it is big. But if they're used to people pleasing, over accommodating, or managing others' emotions, then their partner's sadness or frustration or confusion can feel like something they need to fix. So bandwidth becomes, my boundary can be real even when it negatively impacts you. For the partner on the receiving end of the boundary, they often struggle more than they expect, because from their perspective, the rules changed. And they're going to grieve the old dynamic. Even if they can kind of understand that the old dynamic wasn't fully healthy, it was familiar. There may be loss around physical connection, the ease that the relationship felt for them, predictability, and having access. For the partner on the receiving end of the boundary, bandwidth is I can miss what we had without demanding that it come back. They'll have to work on not personalizing everything. A partner's boundary can easily feel like rejection, punishment, a lack of desire, a loss of love, or it can feel threatening. But it's often about self-discovery, safety, and authenticity. So bandwidth becomes, this may not be about me, even though it affects me. And practicing staying engaged without pushing. There can be an urge, because of how uncomfortable it is, to convince, to negotiate, to pressure, even subtly, or to seek reassurance repeatedly. Bandwidth is staying connected without trying to control the pace of change. For the relationship itself, it's important to recognize that this phase is not dysfunction. It's reorganization. The old system is no longer sustainable, and the new system isn't fully formed yet. So the relationship sits in tension. Growth in one partner often will create instability in the relationship before it creates deeper intimacy. Because you can't build an authentic relationship on top of roles that were never truly chosen. So for couples in this phase, what they need is explicit agreements about the process. That the boundary isn't about ending the relationship. And if it is, I'll become aware of that. I'll be informed of that. That we are in a period of change, that we're going to revisit this, and also that both of us are allowed to have our own feelings around it. They'll need to develop some language for what's happening. And sometimes this starts individually. Instead of the language being everything feels off, which would create a sense of urgency and instability, it becomes, we're renegotiating how we do connection. Because without structure, tension can easily turn into resentment, distance, and misinterpretation. Bandwidth is not only about tolerating difficult people, it's about tolerating change and ambiguity, unmet needs temporarily, your partner's emotional reactions, and your own emotional reactions. Sometimes the hardest relationships to stay present in are the ones that are actually growing. Now, I want to talk about a specific dynamic that I often see with couples, and that's around personal sexuality. When this dynamic in the relationship unfolds, we're no longer talking about boundaries in the relationship. We're talking about reclaiming selfhood in one of the most vulnerable places possible, and that's sexuality. Often when I'm working with couples where this issue shows up and we have to navigate it, sometimes I know it early on in the work with them. I know that one of them has experienced sexual trauma. And I'm aware that at some point that's going to come up in a deeper way to be worked on, but it's often not happening at the front end. So usually for me, the female is the one where this starts to unfold, and the male's on the receiving end of what their partner's going through. I've had a few cases where those roles are reversed, where the male is working through sexuality, sexual trauma, and the female is on the receiving end. But I'm going to talk about it in the dynamic that I most see it. When sexuality has been shaped by family messaging that wasn't accurate or helpful, or religious shame, gender expectations, trauma, abuse, assault, obligation, or people-pleasing, then figuring out what I want is not a small relational adjustment. It can feel like rebuilding an entire internal relationship with your own body. For many women, sexuality was never developed as what feels true for me. Instead, it developed around questions like, what is expected of me? What keeps connection? What avoids conflict? What makes me lovable or desirable? What is allowed? What is dangerous? What is good? Or what is shameful? So later in adulthood, especially inside marriage or long-term partnership, when someone begins asking, what do I actually feel around my own sexuality? There can be enormous uncertainty. When there has been childhood sexual abuse or adult sexual assault, sexuality becomes deeply intertwined with safety, control, dissociation, fear, hypervigilance, numbness, obligation, or a survival response. And those are good conditions for healthy sexuality to emerge from. So as an adult, the body may participate while the self feels absent. Or desire may feel confusing because the nervous system learned to prioritize protection over exploration. This makes boundaries around touch or sex profoundly meaningful. Because what may look to a partner like distance or rejection may actually be someone trying to meet themselves honestly for the first time. Sometimes a sexual boundary is not about pushing a partner away, but instead it's about finally trying to find yourself. For the partner receiving this boundary, this is where enormous bandwidth is required. Because if they only interpret the change through their own pain, they often miss the courage involved. Their partner may be doing incredibly brave work, noticing dissociation, questioning their history around consent, grieving old unhealthy messages, learning how to genuinely feel their desire, learning their preferences, and learning safety in their own body. For the person reclaiming sexuality, bandwidth often means tolerating grief for what was never developed safely, anger about harmful messages, sadness for all the times they've abandoned themselves, uncertainty because desire may not feel clear yet, and guilt because boundaries affect the relationship. And this is where couples need so much compassion because both experiences are true. One partner is reclaiming themselves. The other partner is feeling the impact of that reclamation. Neither reality has to cancel the other. Healthy sexuality is not just about saying yes more freely. Oftentimes, healthy sexuality begins with finally having an honest no. Because authentic consent requires full access to the self. So in the relationship for couples, bandwidth becomes, can the relationship hold this season of discovery? Can there be enough emotional space for grief, patience, curiosity, uncertainty, and healing without rushing the process because the discomfort feels unbearable? The relationship may feel less sexually certain for a season because one partner is becoming more personally real. And in these situations, I've told my male clients when their spouse has a boundary around sex or physical touch or physical affection, they can either be part of their partner's healing or not. And that may not be fair, but that is the crossroads they're standing at. You can either be part of your partner's healing or not. My intention in saying this is to name the reality of the moment without pretending the moment feels equal. Because for the partner, often the husband, in the cases I'm describing, it often feels unfair. And that's valid. They may think, I didn't cause the childhood abuse. I didn't create those messages. I'm trying. Why is our relationship changing? Or why do I have to absorb the impact of wounds that existed before me? And emotionally, that reaction makes sense, which is exactly why bandwidth matters here too. Because adulthood, and especially intimate partnership, often asks us to respond to realities we did not create. They may not feel fair, but it is the crossroads. When someone you love is trying to heal, especially around sexuality, safety, embodiment, and consent, there's not a way to do that without impacting the relationship. That's unavoidable. So the question becomes, what do you do with the discomfort that creates in you? Option one is to focus on your own deprivation. The internal story becomes, well, what about my needs? Or this isn't fair. Or how long is this going to take? And when will things go back to normal? When deprivation becomes the primary focus, there's often pressure to restore comfort quickly. And pressure rarely creates safety. Option two is to participate in creating safety. This doesn't mean your feelings disappear. It doesn't mean you don't grieve. And it doesn't mean that your needs stop mattering. It means recognizing, if I truly care about authentic intimacy, then safety matters more than speed. And healing often asks partners to tolerate seasons where love is being rebuilt differently. And often that doesn't feel like love. One more caveat that I add for partners on the receiving end of a boundary like this is that their partner needs or their partner's boundary may tap into some of their childhood trauma, which is why it may feel impossible for them to accept the boundary and stay regulated. This is where the complexity of complex PTSD and emotional flashbacks become really relevant to the work that we're doing. It is work we need to do. And sometimes the partner's boundary gives us space to do that work. Attachment will make all of this harder because when connection feels threatened, we feel urgency. We want to fix it, to resolve it, or at least to stabilize it. Developing bandwidth allows for connection without urgency. Because sometimes what's activated isn't just the current moment. It's an old story. I'm not safe. I'm not chosen. I'm too much. I'm not enough. Bandwidth means recognizing the story, recognizing where those messages started, and working on those messages without letting them take over. So what does it look like to protect yourself versus abandoning yourself? I think this is one of the most important distinctions when it comes to bandwidth. Protecting yourself looks like having boundaries, awareness, and choice. Abandoning yourself brings us into over-accommodating, silence, or self-betrayal. Bandwidth allows protection As I said at the beginning, bandwidth is not about eliminating difficult emotions. It's about expanding your capacity to stay with yourself inside difficulty. Whether it's a former colleague you don't trust, a family member you love, or a relationship that is changing. Healing means difficult people and situations take up less of your life because you have more access to yourself. Bandwidth is not pretending something feels safe when it doesn't. Bandwidth is staying connected to yourself while honoring what you know. If this episode resonated, share it with someone that you know is navigating a difficult relationship or a season of change. And take a moment to ask yourself, where am I enduring instead of regulating? And what would it look like to come back to myself? At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.